So, welcome to today's session on Introduction to Research Methodology. I'd like to begin by apologizing for my voice. It's going to be quite low throughout the entire session, and it might sound a little unclear, but that's only because of my cold. But hopefully, it won't really be much of a distraction. All right, so having put that aside, let's look at what's in store for today's session. Now, I'm not really going to go in depth into research methods, but just to give you a very brief introduction to what research actually is, so that we have an understanding of what research is like and what can you expect basically in research. All right, so what is research actually? So Albert Einstein said that if we knew what we were doing, it wouldn't really be called research. And if that is true, then what exactly is research? Now, as I'd like to say, research is an attempt to understand the world around us. At least in psychology, we're saying that we want to understand the world around us and our behavior within this world. So it's almost like the first time that we would have stepped into a library that was filled with books, and we would have noticed that the books have been put in a certain order, and there are various topics that the books have been written on, also various languages that the books are written in. And we know that these books have been written by someone or some people, but we don't really know whom. Neither do we know how have they actually written it. So that curiosity, that inquisitiveness that we have to want to know about things is the basic premise of how research begins. So let's look at the nature of scientific research. So we're saying that the field of psychology, we look at research to help us understand behavior better, to help us understand the world better, and research becomes a very important or significant aspect of this understanding. So if you look at the nature of scientific research, and if you see here, there are a few pointers. So we have general approach and attitude, we have observation, reporting, concepts, instruments used, the measurements that are made or taken, and the hypotheses that are formalized. So these become the basic pointers upon which research is built. Now let's look at each one individually. So the first one that we're looking at is general approach and attitude. Now, when we talk about general approach and attitude, we are talking about how exactly should we approach research? What kind of an attitude should we have? So we generally say that research requires you to be skeptical, inquisitive, curious, um, someone who'd like to question why things happen the way they do. And if we look at it generally in life, we tend to use intuition to make an assumption or to answer the question why. And I wouldn't really say that intuition is the best way to go. So although most research begins with intuition because we want to understand why certain things happen in the way they do, or what caused a certain thing. So intuition does lay the foundation or is the beginning step towards having an a research attitude. But you notice that since we're saying it's scientific research, we don't really give a lot of emphasis to intuition. And the only reason why we don't is because our intuition tends to be laced with our own biases, and most often than not, we don't really factor in evidence that needs to be factored in. And since we're saying research is scientific and it is empirical, there is very little room for intuition within it. All right, the next pointer that explains the nature of scientific research is observation and reporting. Now, all of you have been doing class observation for quite a while, and y'all have a certain idea of what y'all have reported, what y'all have noticed, and what y'all have mentioned in your reports. So, observation and reporting basically go hand in hand. But nonetheless, what we're talking about in observation and reporting is that when you observe a particular scene, let's take for example the scene that's there in the slide that you can see right now. So if I were to ask you, how would you describe the scene? Now you could describe the scene as it is in the basic description, or you could describe it with your own inferences, right? So if I'm saying that I'm describing it as it is, I would say that I can see there are one, two, three. Is that three or four? Okay, four and five. Let's say I can see five women, one man lying on the floor, one woman on the right hand side holding hands with another man. So there are two men in that entire scene. The scene is on a road. One woman is attending to the man, or at least is bent over and looking at the man, right? So that would be a basic description of what the scene is like. And but if I were to use inference, I'd say that the woman is attending to the man and everyone else is just watching. There are two women who are approaching the man. Yes, so what I'm doing here is then I'm making sense of the situation, but I'm also adding in information based on what I think actually is happening, which is where inference comes into place. Now, when we're looking at research, we don't want either extreme. We don't want it to be completely descriptive, because then there is no goal in mind. It is not really the best or the most appropriate way to go about it. Neither do we want it in the extreme of being only inference, because what we're saying then is that we are putting our own subjective perception into the picture when we're reporting it. Yes. So what we would then say is that we are looking at a balance between the two. Yes, we want objective data. Yes, we want unbiased description, but we also want to understand the inferences that can be made from it. But when we're making inferences, we want to avoid making inferences too quickly without having collected enough data. And that's when we're looking at the amount of control that we could lay. So if you look at most research and anyone who's talking about research, everyone talks about the amount of control that you'd have in a situation. And control in and by itself is considered as an essential ingredient in science and in research. Yes, and that's how we look at when we say in research we have an independent variable, we have a dependent variable. So the amount of control that we're able to exert over that situation. So let's say I pick an independent variable. Let's say I want to see the effect of um, helpful behavior on the people that notice it. Yes, so I'm controlling the amount of behavior that someone can actually see. So I will put someone in a situation. Let's say for example in this scene that you can see, I have asked the girl who's bending over the man to help this man who's lying on the floor. So I will make sure there's a man lying on the floor, and I will make sure that there's a woman who's attending to it, and then I want to see what is the reaction of the people around them. Yes, so I'm exerting an amount of control, and that would be my independent variable that I'm able to exert a control over. And my dependent variable would then be what I intend to study. So I'm intending to study the reaction of other people around them. Yes, But nonetheless, when we're talking about observation and reporting in research, we're looking at observation being unbiased, we're looking at observation being unambiguous. We want it to give a detailed description of the situation, but we also want to be able to infer information from it, which should be made only when we have collected adequate data. All right, so that's observation and reporting in scientific research. The next point that we're looking at is concept. Now, in our daily lives, we talk about a lot of things with a lot of people. Yes. And when we're talking about certain things, now, generally, when you talk about concept, what we're trying to say is that concept could be anything. It could be a non living object, it could be an event, it could be a person, right? And when we're, like I was saying, that when we're talking to other people and we're having a conversation about a certain concept, let's say, for example, I'm talking about family, right? Most often than not, we don't realize that both parties who are in the discussion, or those who are debating or having a conversation or an argument about a certain topic, don't realize that both these individuals tend to have very different ideas about that specific topic, that both of us tend to understand or tend to describe the topic or uh, define that specific concept as being completely different. So let's say, for example, and this is the most common example that I tend to use, is that the understanding of good and bad. Yes, and those who have been with me in my batch will definitely understand what I'm saying. So when you talk about, let's say that certain thing is good. So let's say I was saying that we're talking about a family, right? Or let's say we're talking about movies, and now we're talking about a certain movie. Let's say some recent movie that you've watched, and I tend to tell my friend that, oh, this movie was really good, right? Or I might be saying that, oh, the movie was really bad. So when you ask the other person what they understood when I said it was good or when I said it was bad, you'd realize that their understanding of what is good and bad might not really be the same understanding of what I meant in terms of good and bad. So, what you realize here is that both of us tend to have a perception of what is good and bad as being completely different. So, maybe I meant good as in it had good plot, it had a good story, but for someone else, good for a movie might mean that if a movie is humorous, it's good. Yes. So when I use the term good, or when I use the concept good or bad, the concept, we tend to often generally use it fast and loose. Yes. But this is not something that would work in psychology. So what psychologists then tend to do is that we, yes, look at concepts, but we refer to them as constructs. And by constructs, what we're trying to do then is to operationally define them. Now, all those who have, now I'm assuming most of you have some idea of what research is. So, at some point in time, you would have definitely come across the concept of operational definition. Now, by operational definition, all we're trying to say is that it is a definition that explains, or yeah, so it is a definition that explains the construct that we intend to study in terms of observable behavior and behavior that can be measured or that is measurable, right? So let's say, for example, I'm trying to study intelligence, and my operational definition for intelligence then would be, let's say I intend to use the Wechsler's scale. So my operational definition then would be the individual's score on the Wechsler scale. And that is my definition for intelligence for the research that I am conducting using the variable of intelligence. Yes. So what becomes important for us is that to convert our concepts into constructs, so that no matter who is reading that research, they are able to understand what exactly is being studied, what exactly is being described, and there is no ambiguity, or there are no doubts about what is understood about that specific construct. All right, moving on, now coming to instruments and their measurement. Now, all of us know that since we're saying that it's scientific research, and we are definitely using some tool to measure something. Yes. So, most often than not, you'd find that usage of instruments requires accuracy and precision in the reporting of the data. Now, it's easier said than done when we're considering psychological concepts, because that's what we are trying to study. If we were trying to study, let's say, heart rate and its effect on, let's say, a relation between heart rate and headache, or something as simple as that, it's easier to measure heart rate. But how can I measure headache? Yes. So when you have a specific instrument to measure physical concepts, it's easier because I can measure heart rate using an ECG. I can measure BP. I can measure blood sugar level. Yes, and all of these things are, we're talking about measuring physical concepts. I can measure height. I can measure weight. But what do we do when we have to measure psychological concepts? So yes, we tend to use tools, and most often than not, you'd notice that we do have tools, like for example, let's say measure of aggression. Yes, we have trait aggression, we have state aggression, we have measures of anxiety, we have measures of stress, and we tend to use a lot of tests as instruments to help us measure psychological concepts. We do also have instruments that help us measure, like for example, measuring reaction time. It's possible to measure. Like for example, in this picture, if you can see, we are trying to measure galvanic skin response. Yes, so there are tools that help us measure. But whenever we're looking at measurement or usage of tools, we also want to consider the reliability and validity of these tools. Now, I am sure that you all have come across these concepts at some point, whether it be in research or whether be it in testing. You'll have definitely come across it. So reliability and validity then become very important or very crucial factors that we need to consider whenever we are using an instrument to measure something which is going to provide us with the relevant data to conduct the research, or to formulate the basis for that research findings. So by validity, I'm just very quickly going through reliability and validity. By validity, what we're trying to say is that we're looking at an instrument that measures what exactly it says it's going to measure. So for example, if a test, I'm using a test and a test says that it's going to measure intelligence, then it has to measure intelligence. Yes. Similarly, when you're looking at reliability, I'm saying by reliability, I'm saying that it's whatever the measure is, it is going to be consistent for that person. So obviously you have different types of validity and different types of reliability, and I don't want to get into it right now. But the point being here is that no matter what instrument we use, it needs to be reliable and valid for us to consider the data that is being obtained out of the usage of that instrument. All right. The next point that we're looking at now, and I believe this is the last point of among the nature of scientific research, and the last point here is hypothesis. Now, what do we mean by hypothesis? Again, this is a concept that I would believe that most of y'all are aware of. So by hypothesis, what we're trying to say that it is a tentative explanation for something, or at least until we discover maybe otherwise. But it's an assumption that we make based on the literature and the theories that we might have read and the research studies that we might have gone through. Yes. So what we're saying then is that your hypothesis provides you with a direction in terms of what you're expecting to find in that research study that you are conducting. Yes. Now there are definitely various types of hypotheses and various characteristics that you would want to consider for a hypothesis. But nonetheless, what is the most crucial characteristic of a hypothesis is that above all, it must be testable. Now, what do we actually mean by a hypothesis being testable? I'm sorry. There are many instances when a hypothesis becomes untestable. One of them is when the hypothesis is inadequately defined. And by that, we're saying that the concepts that are involved within the hypothesis are inadequately defined, so much so that they cannot be measured or they cannot be observed. That is what we're trying to say by inadequately defined, right? Another way of looking at when an instance of hypothesis being untestable would be that if a hypothesis is circular in nature. Now, let me give you an example to explain this. By circular, what we're trying to say is, if for example, I'm saying my hypothesis is that a particular child does not pay attention in class, or a child tends to be distracted because he has difficulties with paying attention, or he has, let's say, attention deficit disorder. So in other words, what I'm trying to actually say here, my hypothesis is that the child is not paying attention. That is, by getting distracted, the child is not paying attention because he's not paying attention, which means that my question is answering the question itself, and that makes it circular in nature. And this is not something that I can actually test. So this would not be the best way to formulate a hypothesis. Yes. So a hypothesis needs to be testable. It needs to help you with direction, and a hypothesis is always going to be based in literature or previous research and based on theories and concepts. Okay. So now that we have an idea of what research, or what is the nature of scientific research, to what end are we looking at having these characteristics, right? So moving on, we are going to look at what are the goals of a scientific research, or what are the goals of conducting. All right. So the first goal that we're looking at here is the goal of description. Now, by description, what we're trying to say is that research makes an attempt to classify information, to organize information, to catalog information, to catalog events, and also to understand relationships. And by way of doing this, what we're doing then is we are describing what a situation is like. We are describing what is the event. We are describing what is the relationship between the elements in that event. So description becomes the first goal here then. The second goal that we're looking at is prediction. Now, yes, we do tend to do a lot of prediction in research, but research also attempts to predict behavior, right? So to be able to predict behavior and to be able to meet this goal, what we're saying then is that research is conducted to identify correlationship between variables. Yes. And when I understand the correlationship between two variables, or between many other variables, two or more variables, I'm then able to predict the behavior of the second or the third or the fourth variable. Now, what do I mean by correlation? Yes, by correlation, simply put, what I'm saying is that there are two variables that exist together, and one tends to have an effect on the other, or one tends to vary with the other. Yes, so they are bound by a relationship. Now, obviously, there are different types of correlations as well, but I am not getting into it right now. Yes, so I'm able to understand that there is a relationship between two variables, and because I understand this relationship, I know, and then I can predict that when something like this happens, the likelihood of something else happening is also high. That's when I'm predicting behavior. Yes, but you need to keep this in mind that when I'm predicting behavior, I am not inferring cause. I am not telling you why it's happening. I know that one occurs with the other, but I don't really know why it's occurring or how it's occurring. All I know is that they occur. Yes, so we are not inferring any cause in prediction. All that we're talking about is the relationship between the variables and how behavior can be predicted because of an understanding or identification of that relationship. The third goal that we're looking at here is explanation. And by explanation, what we're saying is that we are making causal inferences. So, yes, it's very important to be able to describe behavior. Yes, and to be able to predict behavior. But when we're trying to understand human behavior, we also want to understand what is the reason behind it. We also want to understand what is the cause. And that's when explanation comes into the picture. Now, when we consider explanation of behavior and when we make causal inferences, there are three conditions that play a very important role in deciding the cause of behavior. The first condition being covariance. And by covariance, what we mean to say is that they occur together. Yes, they co-vary. Now let's look at an example. So if I say that I fall down, yes, so I'm walking down the stairs and I fall down, and then I realize that I have a pain in my ankle. Yes, so that would be covariance. So I would then say, or I would then infer that because I fell down, I've hurt my ankle. Yes, so I'm saying that the hurt is caused because of the fall that I had. So that's a causal inference that I'm making. So that's our first condition, that both the way need to co-vary. So I need to have fallen down for the pain to have occurred. Yes, so that's a covariance. The second condition that needs to be met is the time order relationship. Now, what we're saying is that whatever I'm inferring as the cause needs to have happened before the effect. Yes, so the fall needs to have happened before the pain, and only then can I say that it's a cause and effect relationship. All right, so that's our second condition. The third condition that I have when we're looking at explanation and giving causal inferences is that I need to be able to eliminate all other plausible alternatives to that effect. Yes, so what I'm saying then is I am taking care of all other factors, or I am controlling for all other factors that could have led to the pain in my ankle. So let's say, for example, I will make sure that I was not wearing a heel. So I will say that my pain was definitely not because I was wearing a heel. My pain was definitely not because I have, let's say, low bone density. Yes, so making sure that all other plausible alternatives as causes are eliminated, and then I can say for sure that it's only because of the fall that I had that I sprained my ankle, or there's pain in my ankle. Yes, and that's how experiments are generally developed. So we're looking at an IV, we look at a DV, and when we're talking about the third condition here, what we're talking about is the extraneous variables. Yes, so when I'm explaining, or the goal of explanation in research is to be able to make causal inferences, but keeping in mind these three conditions. The last goal that we have here is application. Now, if you look at what we've discussed so far, we've looked at how our knowledge is expanded with the help of description. Yes, we look at how we are able to understand the relationship between things with the help of prediction. And then we look at how I'm able to understand cause with the help of explanation. But none of these three factors exist in vacuum. All of these exist in the world that we live in. Yes, which is why the fourth goal that we're looking at is application. And this becomes very important because all the information that we have learned so far, whether be it in terms of description, whether be it in terms of prediction, whether it be in terms of explanation, if I'm not able to apply this knowledge, if application is not there, then to what end am I doing this research? Yes, so the main idea then is that we have the goal, last goal for research conduction is to be able to apply this knowledge that we have accumulated, to put it into practice so that we're able to improve life, we're able to improve behavior and life on this earth. So that would be the goal. All right. Now that we have looked at all of the goals of research, let's just quickly look through the basic concepts that we've considered so far. So we've looked at statement of the problem. Yes. So the statement of the problem is basically the question that we have, the research question that you would have. Yes. Then we looked at what are the variables involved. So you have the IV, you have the DV, and you have the EV. So we're looking at IV as the independent variable that I can control as an experimenter, the dependent variable that I want to see its effect on, and I have the extraneous variables. Those are the other confounding variables that I need to control in order to see, or in order to make this causal inference that the IV is actually the reason why the DV has occurred. Yes. Then we looked at hypothesis as being an assumption that we make that helps us direct our research. And then we looked at sampling. So basically when you say sampling, we're looking at the data um, to which population is this research going to be applicable. Then I look at research design. So what we're saying is that based on the strategy, based on how the research is going to be conducted, or based on what goal I'm trying to meet, that would decide what your research design is. Yes. And then we're looking at data collection and reporting our findings. All right. So now that we have some idea of what research is, so what we've looked at so far is the nature of scientific research. We've looked at what are the goals that we're trying to meet with research. Now let's quickly look at the process of research. Now I'm going to go very quickly through the process. I will not really go in depth into it because this is just so that you have an idea of what research is like. Okay. So let's look at the first one. So first is the research question. Yes. You need, like we said, that you need to have a general approach, general attitude to be able to come up with the research question. So how do we come up with the research question? We read on various topics. You find something interesting in those topics. You read up on previous research that has been conducted, and anything that you're curious about is what you read up on. Yes. And then after that you notice that there tends to be some there tend to be some loopholes or some inconsistencies. So it could be a theory that you were reading, it could be a research paper that you were reading, or for that fact you're even considering your own experiences. Yes. And when you find that loophole is when we move on to the second point, is when you're generating a hypothesis. So let's say that you find a loophole in, or an inconsistency in a particular theory, and you want to understand when is it applicable or why is it applicable. So then you look at your hypothesis being formulated. When you've identified what is it that you actually want to study is when you formulate your hypothesis. Yes. And obviously your hypothesis is going to be based on literature review, theories, concepts. Okay. The third step is operationally defining, and this I've already mentioned before in much detail. So what we're saying then is that I will operationally define my variables included in the research. Yes. Once I have defined them operationally, then I move to the next step, is finding a suitable research design. Now the research design like I mentioned before, is based on the question that I have, my research question, and my goal of that research. So based on whatever goal it is, whether it's description, whether it is explanation, whether it is prediction, or whether it's application, will define what my research design will be like. Once I'm able to identify the research design, then I will consider implementation of the research. That's when I move into considering the data collection. But to be able to collect data, I need to also consider ethics in research. Now, what do we mean by ethics? All we're trying to say is that you want to identify the risks, the benefits, and keep the welfare of the participants in mind before you conduct any kind of research. Yeah. So obviously there's a lot of debate on ethics in research. So we always say that have a debriefing, make sure your participants are aware that they are going to be a part of a research. If it's an experiment, that they are aware that they're going to be a part of an experiment. Yes, and unless and until there is consensus, or sorry, unless and until there is an agreement, voluntary participation from their side, that they are willing, they have an idea what it is, and they're willing to be a part of this experiment or this research, is only then when you're allowed to conduct the research on a specific individual. Yes, once we're able to get all the permissions in place, all the ethical guidelines have been followed, is when you move into collection of data, right? Now, for collection of data, I need to have selected a sample. So then sampling becomes a very important or crucial aspect. Again, there are various types of sampling methods, which we will look into eventually as we're considering research methodology. But for now, all we're saying is that a sample that is selected is a representation of the population that you want to measure, or the population that you are targeting this research on, or the study on. Right? So once I've selected the sample, then I'm able to collect the data, and once I've collected the data, then I move on to the next step, where I'm able to summarize data and then report the findings. Yes, so I will report the results in a paper, and it could be presented in a seminar, it could be presented in a conference, but nonetheless what we're saying is that I have the results, I have the findings, I know whether the hypothesis was accepted, rejected, whether it was partially accepted and rejected, accepted or rejected. And then I'm able to explain what were the limitations of the research and what could be possible future suggestions for this research. Yes, and that's the basic process that you would look at for research conduction. All right. So now that we have some idea of what we're looking at in scientific research, what would we say research actually is, right? And I would summarize this session on introduction to research methodology by saying that yes, research is systematic. Yes, it's an empirical study. Yes, we intend to study and test theories and hypotheses. And yes, research requires a lot of disciplined inquiry of behavior, feelings, and thoughts, because that's what we're studying in psychology. Yes, but nonetheless, research is an attempt that researchers make to unravel our understanding of ourselves, our behavior, and our behavior in the world around us. All right. So, no matter which way we look at it, research requires a lot of discipline, it requires a lot of organization, and requires commitment from the researcher. So, once you're able to identify something of interest, once you're able to look at what exactly is it that you're curious about, is when you know that you have a research topic in mind. And once you're able to look at a topic, you know then in which direction you need to start looking for studies, you know in which direction you need to start looking for theories, and based on the studies that you look at and based on the theories that you find, you know, or you are in a better position to formulate the hypothesis and then to discover or to actually find something that might not be known far. All right. So what we're saying then is that research requires you to be inquisitive, to be curious, to be skeptical in your approach, uh, not to accept everything as it is, but to always question as to why it is the way it is, or how is it the way it is, and what could have actually caused it. All right. I hope this session has been able to give you some information and clear your doubts on what research actually is about. It's a very brief session on research methodology, and most of what research is about has not really been covered here. So there are going to be many future sessions on research methods, the designs, sampling, but as of now, this is only to give you a brief idea about how you would progress and to consider whether research is something that you would be interested in. If you have any questions, you know where to find me, right? So thank you for being available for the session today, and I'll see you all next time. All right, thank you.